Awesome. Thank you so much, Hunter and Tonya. We are so grateful to have you here with us today. As we're kicking off today's conversation, like mentioned, this should be in the chat, but we would love if you're open to it to answer if you identify with having a chronic illness, disability, and or being neurodivergent. Tonya, we cannot wait to hear your insights about balancing workplace accommodation with organizational productivity. But more importantly, I would really love to create space for you to share a little bit why we wanted to open up today's session talking about our identities.
Thank you so much, Sienna. And I think they should just call you Empress of diversity and inclusion. We'll
I'm
have
here
that.
for it.
Yes. Empress of, yes. Thank you so much for inviting me to this talk. I'm really excited to have this conversation and share not only my experience, but to, open up some spaces in which people are curious about not only asking for accommodations, but, being in community with other colleagues who have disabilities or who need accommodations. So for myself, I'm a type 1 diabetic. And, we're going to talk about, having disabilities and I will specify that type 1 diabetes. And let me apologize at the construction noise that you might be hearing in the background. But type 1 diabetes is what's called a dynamic disability. And this is really important, to sort of understand that when we say that a disability or chronic illness is dynamic, it means that it is not static. So I could be having a great day, no problems, and then something will trigger something and I'm out for the rest of the day or the week, So it's not a static disability, and static is not a negative term. I just mean as though, it can move and change. And that's really important to recognize that so many of us have dynamic disabilities. Our neurodivergence is dynamic, right? And I love using that word. It feels a little bit more powerful. It feels a little bit more accurate because it shows exactly how humans work, right? Most of us are not, in the same state at all times. I wish, for all of us that we could be, but then we wouldn't change. We wouldn't have the beautiful contrast that we need to survive. So for myself, being someone with a dynamic disability, I also have a service dog. And, back in the olden times, pre-COVID, he would come to class with me and, we had to do an entire, work around him coming into classes and making sure my accommodations work. And I had extensive conversations with my doctors and, people who I worked with around what it meant to be someone having a dynamic disability and how that affects other parts of my working life. So, yeah.
Yeah, no, I mean, thank you so much, Tonya, and also for giving a little bit of knowledge on the differences. And I think it's just so important, again, to look at the expansiveness of what this looks like for folks with chronic illnesses, disabilities, or neurodivergence. So I love it. I want to really kick us off hearing a little bit more about your story. And you also talk about the importance of empathy in leadership and in life, right? And you really hone into what is the difference between empathy and clarity. So could you tell us a little bit more about the differentiation and the importance of making sure that those two things?
Yes, thank you for that question. Well, empathy, I believe we are all somewhat empathic. There are definitely people who do not have empathy, but, from this point, and especially for women, we're sort of trained to have more empathy than not. But empathy must be cultivated. It cannot, if we think of this as a beautiful garden, empathy can be something that runs wild, it can be a vine. It can overtake you, and then you become the do-gooder, the one who wants to fix it, the one, and that's not productive either. So in order to have a productive relationship and a transformative relationship with empathy, it has to be cultivated. And, many women, we are constantly finding ourselves in leadership positions, not because we were like, I'm going out to be a leader and I'm going to be the boss, but often it's because there's a space and we feel bad that the space is empty. We apply our own feelings, our own cultural, social, and health stigmas, and we reflect that onto others when it may not be true. Think about the times that maybe you looked at someone sitting at a restaurant by themselves and thought, oh, wow, that's sad. They're eating on their own. Yet this person is having the best day of their lives. They're feeling their most free. So in
Exactly.
order to cultivate that, we have to turn it into a compassion, right? Compassion is an action, right? But it has to have clarity. And I talk about this to people with chronic illnesses, disabilities, and neurodivergence. And I talk about this with leaders of corporate, world. Staying curious without judgment has to be the first thing. It has to be about your body, right? When I was diagnosed, I didn't, like there's a time where in a space where you don't want to know what your body's doing. Like, I don't want to know what the like you just feel the effects of it. But, you don't, if you have a stomach ache, you don't necessarily judge it, or, you just say, oh, well, how did this happen? How can I fix it? Right. So if you can maintain a curiosity without judgment, that's really important. And also it's important to know, what do you need to know to understand? Like, what is it? Being clear about what is it you need to understand something. Are you understanding your body? Are you understanding laws and regulations around accommodation? Are you understanding, someone's capacity? And we'll talk about capacity versus consistency. Because in no way, shape, or form are we able, I know a lot of people love to say you can fix or cure different diseases and ailments, but you're really not there to do that, right? We're not in this moment talking about fixing or curing. We just really want to stay out of the trap of perceived commonalities, right? We want to stay out of the trap of thinking, oh, if I was in this person's shoes, right? Because that's what empathy does. It wants us to be in that person's shoes. But sometimes we don't need to be there. We just need to be able to look at them, listen to them with respect, and really try to understand what they need, not how to fix them.
100%, Tanya. And I mean, you bring up so many interesting points. If y'all who are watching are taking notes, please do start now if you haven't been. But I think, Tanya, when you're mentioning also for allies and advocates, when you are thinking about what that empathy and what that compassion looks like, again, not from a savior complex if I need to fix and or help this person, but instead really being able to lean in, understand what they need, realize that that might change from day to day or week to week. And then also really being able to say, how can I show up in the way that you need, not in the way that I think that you need. So
yes.
Very, very, I love that.
To stand with, right? To stand with, not in the shoes, but to stand with them.
Yes, I love that. And I mean, you were talking a little bit about compassion as well and your leadership approach around compassionate leadership. So I want you to tell us a little bit about what is compassionate leadership for you and what does that look like?
Well, compassionate leadership really begins with clarity, right? It really begins with, having the foresight and, the empathy to say, what is at stake here? And that was something, that when I asked for accommodations, no one asked me about it. No one, and there's a fine line. We understand that we don't want to overstep boundaries at work, and we don't, but there is a level of, hey, I'm just curious about, you. I'm curious about, because the job will happen if the person feels safe, right? So the next part about compassionate leadership is understanding capacity versus consistency, right? So I cannot always be consistent 100%, but I might have the capacity to do something. Like I can't perhaps consistently go into the office every single day at 9 a.m. I might have a pump failure in the middle of the night, which knocks me out, and I'm just not able to be on at that time. But I might have the capacity to be at that meeting on Zoom from home, where I can care for myself, where I can do the things that I need to do. Understanding what does work, right? So for the person asking for accommodation and also the person who is receiving that request for accommodation, how does it work? What do we need to get done, right? And what I was just saying, flexibility and security, making sure that you build in space for, okay, I know that this person may have these issues, not, oh God, I can't rely on her to do this. It's, okay, I need to make sure I'm maintaining a level of flexibility so that they feel secure enough to operate in their highest capacity. So that is really, really important. When we think about often from a person, from being a person with chronic illness and neurodivergence, the thing that we often fear the most is being discounted. Like, I might say, no, I can't come to your party every single time you ask me, but you asking me really like makes me want to be there or to share that, and to understand that I'm not saying yes or no because I'm trying to be difficult or I'm lazy or whatever, but that because I literally I do not have, again, the capacity, right, to be that way. And I think the last thing, well, there's two more things I just want to say that are really important in compassionate leadership, is naming your privilege. Whether you are the person who is chronically ill or you are the person who is a supervisor, coworker, understanding what your privilege is, not to say, oh, well, I'm less than that person because I have privilege or they want my privilege, but saying, oh, okay, well, in this moment, and I do it for myself, in this moment, I can afford to have the insulin that I need. But I recognize that there are hundreds, thousands, perhaps even hundreds of thousands of people who cannot afford that insulin. And, understanding that is a part of turning that sort of uncultivated empathy into active compassion. So that's really important. And I think the final thing is envisioning. Take the time. And I think this is so important for women in the workspace, women who want to be strategic leaders, right? Who want to say, okay, I fully step into this role because I choose it, not because it was given to me or the space was empty or I was afraid of what they wouldn't say or what they would say if I didn't or did do it. But envision, what does the future look like in a woman-led workspace? A truly inclusive workspace that employs a majority of people who are queer, disabled, neurodivergent, women, trans. What does that look like? And I always love, the 1980s movie 9 to 5, right? Where, when the boss comes back, the women have changed, because the entire workspace, and not to give more privilege or to slack off, but to make productivity not a harsh reality, but a joyful space in which we're all working together, we're all feeling connected. We have, what does that look like for you? What do you think that should look like? Not on someone else's idea, but working towards that vision, sharing that vision with your colleagues is really important, I think, for the future of working America, because we're stuck. We're in a place of the old and the new. So the only way to move through that is to envision, a beautiful, joyful possibility.
I mean, I love that, Tonya. You touched on, again, so many great points. I want to dive in before we get a question from the audience, but I want to dive into a little bit about what you were mentioning in regards to intersectionality of identities as well. And then also the importance of that psychological safety in the workplace, right? So how might folks who either identify as having a chronic illness or a disability or being neurodivergent be able to, number one, feel as if they have that psychological safety, but then also for leaders, how can we create that sentiment of psychological safety from a way that honors everyone's needs?
Right. And that is such a dynamic question, right? Because every workplace is different, every colleague is different. And, some of us work alone better than with others. But allowing the space to say to someone, well, how do you work best, right? So in academia, I might get, an assignment to do, XYZ administrative task, but, that's maybe not my strong suit. I need someone else who's doing that, at least to work alongside me. You don't have to be doing the same thing I do, but I like collaborative workspaces where we can say, okay, well, I have this to do, you have this to do. Let's hold each other accountable. Let's just work together in this moment. Finding a creative way to help people do their best is really not that difficult. It's about clarity, asking questions. How do you work best? Have you thought about how you work best? Have you thought about your needs? How can I help you with your needs so that you can help me accomplish mine? And having that conversation, it seems so basic, but it is the thing that never gets done often because we have this higher, we have a mission to, uphold. We have deadlines to reach, and that seems more important than how we work together. But the reality is that the work can never be the highest quality if colleagues are at odds or they feel unsafe or that they feel as though they're misunderstood. There's never going to be a clarity and a sentiment that, you know what, I'm a part of this. We all have this, corporate America really sort of wants you to believe that you're a part of a family, but they don't want you to have the conversations that you would perhaps with, a family that is working well together. Not every family works well together, right? So we have to have conversations. We have to know what each other needs. We have to start feeling safer with articulating our needs. And of course, I think it's important for everyone to understand their rights under the ADA, the American Disabilities Act. If you're anywhere else in the world, understand your rights, right? Because there's so much that they will not tell you. When I first started working, my disability was new to me as well. So I had no idea what I even needed, and I didn't know what I could ask for. And so it took me time to understand that. But if I walk into a space already understanding my needs and my rights, wow, that's power. That's power.
100%, Tanya. And I mean, I think taking a little bit of what you said and then also just thinking about the importance of consistency throughout the process, as well as how are we having these conversations before someone joins to know what they need? How are we having them in onboarding? How are we continuously having check-ins across the board to really be able to make sure that for those of us who might be leaders as well in the audience, to really be thinking about how are we having these continued conversations based on some of the tips that Tanya has been sharing and doing this in a consistent way so that folks do feel a sentiment of belonging. Tanya,
well, and I just want to say
please.
one thing,
Mm-hmm.
Especially here, we cannot always ask before we hire, right? Specific questions, but questions like, how do you like to work? What ways do you work best? What makes you feel like your work is important, right? Asking someone what makes them feel that their work is important is really important. That's asking what are your needs without saying, well, without judging, right? And that's what's really key.
It's so true. It makes me think a lot about what is your zone of genius as well, right? I think that that's a really great question to be able to have folks talk through what are their strengths and then also be able to find room for collaboration as well with different people on the teams. I love it. I love it. Okay. So I know we're all dying to ask some questions. We're getting some questions in from the audience that I'd love to ask you, Tanya. Yeah. Zakaya asked, how do you handle the angst of changing the culture where compassionate leadership is spoken but not practiced?
This requires a lot of self-work, right? This requires, and let me say that, I do know what it's like to work in a toxic workspace. I do know what it's like to work at a space in which we say we're all about this, but in reality, there's chaos, right? So understanding yourself and your own needs helps you to create a path. Saying, what are my boundaries? The best advice I was ever given by my one of my work sisters was, she said, girl, don't be afraid to say no. Know where your no is. Know where it is. And practice, how can I give, a gentle but firm no? How can I say, you know what, I'm not going to, I recognize, it's like we were talking about being in family. I recognize this dysfunction, but I don't have to be a part of this dysfunction. And me constantly standing my ground and representing myself with my integrity intact, is small steps forward. We have to remember we cannot change an entire, culture. We cannot make people see us as the humans that we truly are sometimes. But if we don't forget our own humanity, if we remember that our peace, our rest, and our joy are really the only things that we are working for, right? We're not working just, like we have all these other things that society tells us that we need money for, but really, those are the key things that we need. So if that's not working for you, then, there are times in which you have to say, okay, this is just not the space for me. And you have to maintain a level of, very fixed focus on your own needs and your own self so that you are not swept up in the toxicity. Stop telling yourself the same story all the time, that they don't like you, they see you like this or whatever. Tell yourself the story of who you want to be, envisioning, right? Tell yourself the story of who you are in this space and how it is that you provide value that even if no one else sees, you have.
Again, and then that goes back to that sentiment of power and ownership of ourselves, our identities, and our realities as well. I mean, I'm taking notes. I'm taking mental notes. I hope that y'all are as well. For those of you who are watching either live or in the recording, I want to give space in case other folks would like to ask the amazing Tonya some questions. But in the meantime, Tonya, you mentioned before, what would it look like, going back to that envisioning, but what would it look like if we can envision a woman-led workspace, and what does that mean to us? I'd love to dig in a little bit around your thoughts there.
Well, I think that, we have a lot of stereotypes around this, and we're in such a crucial time that, just the act of envisioning is, it's transformative, but it's also transgressive. And talking about that vision, right? Having conversations with other women. And I'm talking about not just women who are, at your level at work, but, the secretary who just got there to the, administrative assistant who has been there the longest. Cultivating relationships that are positive and based on, a baseline of respect. And, that is something that is often forgotten, that we do have power in numbers, that our conversations actually open up so many solutions, right? So if you perhaps spend 15 minutes talking to someone who, like for myself, I, work in academia. I don't only speak to people in my department. I want to know what's going on over there in the sciences. How are you all being, treated? What are some of the things that you are facing? How can we collaborate and provide support for one another in this space? And then perhaps that's when it comes out into the public. So the conversations between women, I think we often, sometimes, this is just the nature of work sometimes, that we like to complain, right? But we have to remember that with every complaint, there's a solution somewhere. So unless you are, talking to someone with a solution in mind of, let's say, just, camaraderie, right? Then articulate that. Hey, I just, I know you're working over here. I see you, I see you doing the work. I appreciate you doing the work. What are some challenges that you face? What are some joys, right? Like, what are some things that you really like about your work? How can I get there? So these kinds of conversations with, people outside of our immediate working connection are really important to help women understand what it's like to be on all of these levels. And a woman who is in leadership, who does not have the conversations, who does not acknowledge and seek out, and I don't want to necessarily use the word sisterhood in a fake way, right? But to really understand other women, then this is where we're at a stalemate. When you dismiss someone for an action that they did, like that personal stuff is what clogs up a lot of things at work. right? Especially if you have people who've been there for years and years. There's so many personal transgressions that have happened that someone's holding a grudge from years ago. Do what you can to clean it up. Even if you can't clean it up with the other person, clean it up within yourself. Clean it up within yourself, because that is really, really important to release in order to be productive.
Absolutely, Tanya. And I mean, just recapping a lot of what you said, because you touched on so many amazing points. One was going back to that sentiment of curiosity that we've been talking about throughout the entire conversation. So how are we making sure that we're staying curious around folks who might be like us, and then also folks who might be different from us as well? And then when we're thinking about what does it look like to have a woman-led organization, I want to lean in as you were sharing and you were talking about complaining. I love that, because my brain did a little bit of a switch, and it was like seeing that as a value add of being able to say, hey, we're understanding where there might be a gap in a system, and we're able to identify that, name that, and then most likely position a solution to that as well. So I love a lot of what we're talking about. And I also think when you were sharing, and then I'll wrap up to give you some time for the last question, but when you were sharing about the importance of, again, like the expansiveness of that as well, and thinking about, as corny as it sounds, but like the collaboration over competition analogy, really leaning into that. And something that we often talk about is that it's not that the pie slices get smaller when we're all working together, the pie actually gets bigger, right? So really leaning into that in regards to, how we're centering inclusion across the board. Tanya, we have 3 minutes left. I want to have you end us off. And again, thank you so much to all of you who are watching in the audience right now. I would love for you to end with, what is some advice that you might have for compassionate leaders when communicating with different team members who are asking for accommodations in the workplace?
I think that transformation is really key for us to remember in these times. We're in a constant state of transformation. You are, not a constant or fixed being. You are in pursuit of what is next and new. And in order to recognize what is next and new, you have to ask the questions of yourself, right? First, and then, ask yourself the questions of others. And, Sarah Ahmed, who is a brilliant scholar, she talks about complaint. She talks about complaining, especially in academia, and how the complaint makes you the problem. But if you can reimagine that thought, that the complaint puts you in a position of the transformational worker, right? Of the person who is seeking transformation, to how can, not just like, let's just stay here because it works. How can we make it work better? How do we make sure that people are staying with these jobs, right? It's not the money that's keeping them there. It's that feeling of flexibility and security that we're all craving right now. So instead of thinking of, oh, well, I have an issue or a problem and that's a complaint and that makes me the problem, think about it as, okay, I need to transform this space for myself. I need to transform myself so that I can move within this space in my own power and with the compassion that is necessary for us to move forward, to transform and to make the vision of the world that we want to see happen.
Amazing. Well, Tanya, what powerful words for us to end with. I really quickly, if you would like for folks to reach out to you, where might they be able to find you on the internet? Can you share?
Sure. Yes, my website is TonyaCherieHegamin.com, and you can find me there. I'm on Instagram as Diabichi, and I'm also on Instagram as It's Me, Tonya Cherie.
Amazing. Well, Tanya, thank you so much for your time, sharing your experience and expertise today, and we'll be talking to you soon. Hunter,
Thanks
over
so
to you.
much.